Everybody loves a good ghost story, right? Well, here's a short story that happened to me and my friend a few years back when we were in high school, and we still can't explain it. Maybe you can. My friend's grandma had just died, and his entire family was in town for the funeral services. He wasn't really close to his family, so he wasn't really partaking in all the gatherings the family was hosting. Because of his strange relationship with the family, his mom allowed him to have a friend around for the weekend, hence why I was there. However, the bad part was that his extended family was staying at his house. It was a cluttered household, and everyone seemed to be at each other's throats all the time. On Saturday night, his mom gave us a proposition we couldn't pass up. She wanted us to go to his recently deceased grandmother's house and start packing up things in the boxes. She said we could stay there for the night so we could get out of the cluttered house. Now, you may think staying in a house like this would freak us out, but honestly, we didn't care. Neither one of us was a believer in the paranormal, and we didn't believe in bad energy or any of that stuff. We just looked at this as a quiet escape from his crazy family and an opportunity to have a house alone for the night. We got there around 8 p.m., and we honored our word for a little while. We packed all the kitchen stuff neatly in boxes, and then started packing trinkets and things like that. Around 11, we invited some people over to the house. We weren't supposed to, but we weren't going to pass up the chance of having an empty house. It wasn't a wild party or anything like that, just a few guys and girls hanging out and having some fun. Well, the fun lasted a while. Everyone didn't leave until after 2 in the morning. My friend and I hung out for a little while longer, but then we decided to go to bed shortly after. We were in the living room, both of us getting ready to pass out on the couches when my friend asked if I could hear that noise. I didn't hear any noise. He was quiet for a minute, and then pointed it out again. This time, I heard it. It was this strange tapping sound. It didn't sound like a furnace or anything like that. It was a rhythmic tapping, like if you were to tap your fingers on a desk. We both were quiet as we were trying to focus on the tapping. We tried to figure out what it was because it was just so strange. Finally, we reached our breaking point, and we got up to investigate the sound. It was like playing a game of warmer and colder, trying to locate the source of the sound, but we eventually found it where it was the loudest. Inside one of the closets, we could hear the tapping. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little scared. Not because I thought it was anything paranormal, but because I thought someone was in the closet. Then it dawned on us. It was probably one of our friends who must have had a little bit too much to drink, and he was playing a joke on us. We whipped open the door, and surprisingly, there was nobody inside the closet. We could still hear the tapping coming from the back wall of the closet. I was convinced it was some type of pipe or something. My friend then smashed on the wall with his hand in an effort to get the tapping sound to stop. And for a moment, it did. We both stood there for a second to make sure the tapping stopped. And then just seconds later, the tapping started again. But this time, the taps were different. It came in beats of 2. And then a pause. Tap, 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 tap. I'm not sure what possessed me to do this, but I bent over and I tapped back on the wall. I lightly tapped 3 beats and then stopped. To our surprise, the rhythmic tapping stopped, and then tap, 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 then nothing. Whatever was happening, it was just copying the same tapping that we just did. So we tested the theory. We started doing all sorts of different tapping melodies, and after a pause each time, the tapping would be heard coming back at us in identical fashion. We were both freaked out, and we decided to just ignore the tapping and get some sleep. Clearly, this was weird, but it wasn't worth trying to explain. As we shut the door, the tapping turned into a loud banging. Instead of a light tapping on the wall, it sounded like something was trying to break through the wall. I'm not sure why my friend decided to open the door again, but when he did, the banging stopped. And from the dark closet, all we could hear was this whispering sound. I don't know how to describe it really. It was like someone humming, but in a whisper. We just left right at that moment and went back to his house. We didn't understand what was happening, and we didn't want to take any chances. I'm still not a believer in the supernatural, but I will admit, I can't explain this. And in that moment, I was terrified. Does anyone out there have any explanation for me? Was this a ghost? Was it pipes? Maybe it was my friend's grandma messing with us from beyond the grave. About 10 years ago, I was the athletic director of a small elementary school that also sponsors high school basketball teams. This particular event happened on Thanksgiving night. After I had my delicious meal on Thanksgiving with my family, my wife decided that she wanted to go Black Friday shopping. So I went to the gym and started setting up for Friday morning. Every Thanksgiving weekend, starting on Friday, my gym hosts a pretty cool Thanksgiving Day tournament for high school basketball teams. The tournament brings in a lot of revenue for the school and the basketball program, so I like to make sure everything is perfect. I spent about an hour or so setting up chairs, the bleachers, and preparing the snack bar. I figured since I was doing this on Thursday night, I could sleep in tomorrow morning and not worry about rushing to the gym to set up. Just to try and give you a visual of the gym setting, it is a huge gym with only one set of main doors from the gym that leads into a small school. The school is very old, and the hallways are lined with brick. It almost looks like an old prison. The lighting in the hall is dim and dark, even in pure daylight. The school used to be an old home for nuns in the 1930s. It is, objectively, a pretty creepy place. I'm an adult, and I was over 30 years old at the time of this story, and I have been in this school alone at least 100 times, and I still would get a little nervous in there sometimes. So, once I finished setting everything up, I decided to shut the place down and go home for the night. I went into the far corner of the gym to the circuit breaker, and I shut off all the lights. At this point, the gym was lit up by only the moonlight and the glow of the street lights shining through the windows. I walked into the small hallway that I just mentioned earlier, which was nearly pitch black. Just to navigate, I was using my cell phone's flashlight as a source. As I walked down the long hall, I started to hear scratching noises. I stopped walking to try to focus on the loud scratching. It sounded like it was coming from one of the classrooms up ahead. As I pointed my cellular flashlight up the hall, I noticed that the classroom door was opened, and the policy was that all doors were to be locked when the teachers left for the evening. Admittedly, I was terrified for some reason, but the only way to leave was passing the door in the hall to get to the main entrance, which was probably another 30 feet down the hall. Almost completely paralyzed in fear, I slowly began my walk, and as I passed the room, I still can't explain what I saw that evening. It was a greenish silhouette of a man. It's hard to fully explain. I could clearly make out that the outline was of a man, but its form was almost misty. The apparition was wearing a button-up shirt, had parted hair, and was wearing long pants. And when I say he was tall, he was probably standing at about 6'7". I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over me. He was just standing there too, just staring at me. He didn't move or say anything. His face was expressionless. In the brief moment that I stood there and took all of this in, I got very cold. After a few seconds, I finally came back down to reality, and I ran. I looked back once more, and as I got to the main entrance, the green figure was now standing in the hallway. I drove home as fast as I could, and I couldn't get the image of the man out of my head. Of course, as you would expect, not very many people believed me. For the rest of the year, I felt so uneasy every time I went back into the school. I never went back alone, and I walked fast by that classroom every time. I quit as soon as the season was over. That's how messed up this event made me. I still can't quite explain it, and I'm not sure I want to know what I saw that night. But whether you believe me or not, this story will plague me for the rest of my life. The events of this story happened to me about 2 years ago on a very cold winter night. I worked as a nighttime janitor for a church. It was an easy job for the most part, but once a year I would work an overnight shift. I would deep clean the church and get it ready for the winter season, and I would retrieve all of the Christmas and winter decorations from the basement of the church. It is just about as boring as it sounds. I was taken to my limits by the events of the evening, and I'm still not really sure I can explain it. Maybe somebody reading this can explain it better. The church was one of those very big, old-fashioned churches. I had many rows of pews and very old, antique religious statues and decorations. In the far left corner of the church, behind the altar, was a small door that led down into a dark basement. On the right side of the altar was another door. I think this door led to some kind of kitchen. So, my evening commenced as normal. First, I went and got all of the winter and Christmas stuff from down in the basement. It's also important to note here that I absolutely locked the door after going into the basement. I'm a bit OCD, and I always check the locks twice when I'm done with them. Then I swept and mopped and cleaned every inch of that church. I got all of the books, and I stacked them neatly where they belonged. The last thing I needed to do was vacuum the altar, which was all carpet. A few minutes after 3, I started to think I could hear a noise. Figuring that it was just nothing, I looked back down and continued my job. Just before I finished vacuuming, I heard another loud noise. At this point, I was immediately startled. I thought maybe I had left the church door open, but again, like I said, this isn't like me. I will say though, this wouldn't have been the first time a homeless person had tried to break into the church just to get warm, so the thought was at least on my mind. So cautiously I approached the door, and I was reassured when I saw that all the doors were still in fact locked. So what was that noise that I heard? The noise was like a loud bang, like somebody slamming a door. As I started walking back toward the altar, I noticed that the basement door was now wide open, and it was freezing all of a sudden. Even though the church was very old, it was always really warm inside, and for some reason, it was freezing. I swear I could almost see my breath. So, being the fool that I was, I decided to go check the basement out, and I almost threw up because of the smell. It smelled like spoiled meat. It was the most repulsive smell I have ever smelled. Now, remember, I was just down there a couple of hours ago, and it didn't smell at all, and it certainly wasn't this cold either. At this point, I was really struggling to put all of these pieces together. After a moment of walking around in the basement, the lights down there went off for no explainable reason. I used the light on my phone to navigate the freezing basement. I reached one of the corners of the basement to find a pool of this weird black sludge. This was like no other liquid I had ever seen before. It was really thick, like blood, but it was jet black. While I was examining this sludge, I heard another loud bang. I turned and looked back at the stairs. I was so unsettled and shaken, but still figured that there must have been some kind of explanation for all of this. Right before walking up the stairs, I noticed that there appeared to be some kind of shadow at the top of the stairs. It looked like the shadow of a dog or a creature of that nature sitting on its hind legs. I shouted at the shadow, but it didn't move at all. I ran up the stairs, and there was nothing there. The most disturbing part was that I couldn't find anything that was making that shadow. I turned and locked the door, and as I walked off the altar, I noticed that the big cross that sits on the front of the altar was now on the ground. And I swear to you, as I picked up the cross, I felt a burn in my forearm. I screamed, and as I pulled away, I actually had a small scratch on my arm. This was the final straw for me. I quit that night and right at that moment. I didn't try to explain what I had seen, and I didn't explain to the church what I'd seen either. When I tell this story to people, I'm often ridiculed or accused of making it up. But I know what I felt that evening, and this was horrifying. I've reached out to mediums and other types of people who specialize in this stuff, but unfortunately, they say my claim doesn't have enough evidence. Well, I know what I felt that evening, and I'm still mentally scarred from it. And now, every winter season, I'm reminded of the horror of that evening.